Alas, said the mouse, the world is growing smaller every day. At the beginning, it was so big that I was afraid. I kept running, and I was glad when at last I saw walls far away to the right and left. But these long walls have narrowed so quickly that I am in the last chamber already, and there in the corner stands the trap that I must run into. You only need to change your direction, said the cat, and ate it up. Welcome to Positive Read-Ins. Please support this channel and discover new literature by getting your copy of the novel Commuting. You can link to it in the description. You can also link to the Gymnasia Press website where you can get the short story collection Comorbidities and the novel Non-Local. Get all three and start a revolution. The opening read-in was a short story by Franz Kafka called A Little Fable. It is included in its entirety in this David Foster Wallace essay titled Some Remarks on Kafka's Funniness, from which probably not enough has been removed. This essay is included in this book here, Consider the Lobster. The essay was actually a speech that David Foster Wallace gave in 1999 at the Penn Center in celebration of a new translation of Kafka's The Castle. The premise of this essay is that Wallace does not enjoy teaching Kafka anymore because his students don't see the funniness in it, and then he goes on to show us what the funniness is. And by doing this, on one hand, he gives us an interesting look, some insight into Kafka's work, but on the other, he gives us a tool that we can use for analyzing many texts, not just literature. So let's get into that, the tool first. So he says, comparing short stories to jokes, and he's saying that they're actually similar. He says both depend on what communication theorists sometimes call exformation. Exformation is a pun on information, which is a certain quantity of vital information removed from but evoked by a communication in such a way as to cause a kind of explosion of associative connections within the recipient. So exformation is something that the communicator and the recipient, this important information that they both know, it's left out, and there's some trigger in there that both of them, that the listener actually gets it, and it creates this extra meaning. Then in a footnote, typical of Wallace's style, he gives us some examples. One of those comes from the Hemingway short story, A Clean, Well-Lighted Place. He tells us here, he says, compare in this regard the whole. What was the old man in despair about? Nothing. If you know the story, there's an old man who's having an existential crisis. There's no meaning in life. Everything is nothing. Nada, 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 I believe he says in there. And at the end, when the waiter's saying, oh, what is his problem? And he's saying nothing. Well, there's a pun there. It's a joke. One is it's okay, to their eyes, there's nothing wrong with him. But we as the reader know that no, he has this deep kind of problem. He's lacks meaning in his life. Compare that, according to Wallace says, to what he calls a water cooler zinger, a joke. The big difference between a White House intern and a Cadillac is that not everybody's been in a Cadillac. So the exformation there, apparently, is that White House interns, everyone's sleeping with them, apparently. So in both cases, we get either humor or extra meaning based on this information that's being left out. That's exformation. That's what we need to look for. And we can use that in works of literature, jokes, anything that any kind of text that we want to analyze. After that, Wallace goes on to talk about the challenges of trying to figure out the humor in Kafka. One of the problems he calls the psychology of jokes. If you explain a joke, you kind of ruin it. just like I did when I was trying to explain Hemingway's short story there. The other one is what that exformative information, the exformative associations are. And he says here, the exformative associations that Kafka's work creates are not intertextual or even historical. So Kafka's not drawn on other works of literature. He's not drawn on historical information to create these meaning associations for the reader. Kafka's evocations are rather unconscious and almost sort of subarchetypal, the primordial little kid stuff from which myths derive. So they're unconscious, he says, and later Wallace tells us that he equates the unconscious really with the soul. So really there's something deep down that he's evoking. And the result of that, according to Wallace, is that this is why we tend to call even Kafka's weirdest stories nightmarish rather than surreal. And the nightmare might be that deep down nothingness maybe that we're feeling, or something that we share is really a nightmare and not just bizarre, not surreal. So these are the problems of trying to figure out where the humor comes from. Then he goes on to try to explain more about what this humor is. So he says, the claim is that Kafka's funniness depends on some kind of radical literalization of truth. We tend to treat as metaphorical. So Wallace is telling us that Kafka has taken the metaphor and making it literal. And he gives us some examples. And he says, I opine to them, the students, that some of our most profound collective intuitions seem to be expressible only as figures of speech, that's why we call these figures of speech expressions. So Wallace has done this before. He's shown us the profoundness of cliches, of things that we take for granted, like everyday speech, that they actually have some deep meaning in them. He talks about this a lot in that speech, This is Water. But in this case, he gives us some references, the metamorphosis. Think about what does it mean when we refer to people as creepy and gross? Well, the literalization of that creepy and gross means is non-human, the insect that Gregor becomes. So this is what he thinks that Kafka is actually doing in his work. And then this leads him to, as he closes, to critique American society a bit. Some of the problems he sees with humor is that Americans, the children are being taught that jokes are entertainment, and entertainment is just reassurance. And he's saying that it's not that students don't get Kafka's humor, but that we've taught them to see humor as something you get. The way that we've taught them that the self is something that you just have. No wonder they cannot appreciate the really central Kafka joke. And this is where kind of his main point about Kafka, the meaning of Kafka, his central joke is that the horrific struggle to establish a human self results in a self whose humanity is inseparable from that horrific struggle. That our endless and impossible journey toward home is in fact our home. And I think what he's getting at here is that most people, we don't see the importance of the thing that we're doing. We have an eye on some kind of goal, and we don't realize that the thing that we're doing is actually the meaning. This reminds me of another short parable by Kafka, Before the Law. The man is waiting to get in to access the law, and he's never allowed in, and at the end he finds out that he's the only one that could use that door. So really, what's the meaning? It's this waiting here to try to get into this desired destination that you have no access to. So it is pessimistic, it's dark, and that's the nightmarish element that he's talking about. And Wallace is saying this is actually coming from something deep down within us. So I found this to be an informative way to look at Kafka, but also a helpful way, the idea of exformation when analyzing works of literature. And I plan to look at some more Kafka in some coming videos. Thank you.